Hi, everyone. My name is Laura Line. I'm pleased to welcome you to the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine and to our monthly webinar series, Climate Conversations, Pathways to Action. Our conversation today will be recorded and available to view right here after the event. If you'd like to ask questions, please submit them in the Slido box below the video at any time, and we'll incorporate them into the Q&A section of the programming. We also encourage you to participate in the polls that will appear in the same location and to give your feedback after the event in the survey linked above the video. As a reminder, the views expressed in each conversation are those of the participants and do not necessarily represent the National Academies. For today's climate conversation, we'll be diving into the world of native plants. Native species are crucial for maintaining biodiversity, stabilizing soil, and mitigating the impacts of extreme events. Yet there are challenges with maintaining a supply of native seeds and plant materials. Our speakers today will highlight current issues, opportunities for partnerships, and how we can support native species through our own gardens. With that, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Susan Harrison. Susan is the chair and distinguished professor in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy at the University of California, Davis. Her research seeks to understand the large-scale and small-scale forces controlling the diversity of plant communities. She received her bachelor's in zoology and master's in ecology from the University of California, Davis, and her PhD in biology from Stanford University. Susan was a postdoctoral researcher at Imperial College's Center for Population Biology at Silwood Park in England. Susan, passing it over to you.
Hi, and thank you very much for inviting me here. It's really fun to be here. Our objectives today are to understand what we mean by native seeds and what they're for, who uses them for what purposes, and why they're ecologically important, environmentally important, and then to look into this problem of the native seed supply. Why is it that there is a product, there is an industry that produces it, and yet there's this perennial problem that the demand for native seeds is not always met, and we need a greater supply. And I was privileged to be a member of an Academy's study committee on this. Kay Havens, who I'll introduce in a minute, was also on this committee, and so we learned a lot about this problem from a lot of different dimensions. So now I'd like to introduce our speakers, Kay Havens and Carol Capobianco. Kay is the Nagani Vice President and, sorry, I have to read this, make sure I get everything right. Nagani Vice President of Science and Chief Scientist at the Chicago Botanical Garden. Her research interests include ex situ conservation, the native seed supply chain, restoration genetics, and pollination networks. She's active in conservation advocacy with elected officials, collaborates with a variety of academic institutions and stewardship organizations to help improve conservation and restoration efforts for plants and plant communities. Carol Capobianco is a director of the Native Plants Center at SUNY Westchester Community College in Valhalla, New York, where she's provided leadership since 2012 in advancing the center's work of promoting the use of native plants. Carol cultivated her interest in native plants and an understanding of their ecological role through her work at nature-based organizations, including the New York Botanical Garden, the National Audubon Society, and Groundwork Hudson Valley. So welcome, Kay and Carol.
Thanks.
Now for our Act One, we're going to sort of set the stage by talking about what are native seeds and why do we need to think about them. But I'd like to first begin by asking each of you to tell us what brought you to this space.
Sure. Thanks, Susan. I guess I'll start by saying I have been a lifelong plant nerd. I love plants. I've spent my entire career at Botanic Gardens in research capacities. And early on in my career, I worked almost exclusively with endangered species, trying to conserve them, trying to keep them from going extinct. And along the way, recognized that lack of appropriate habitat was one of the biggest threats that they faced. And in order to save the species I cared most about, I really needed to make sure that there were habitats that were healthy and resilient for them to live in. And that kind of led me into this research space regarding restoration and the native seed supply chain.
Wonderful. Thank you. And Carol.
Yes, hi, Susan, thank you, and Amanda and everyone. And Kay, nice to be here. So my background is journalism, and I worked in newspapers and trade publications, and then I started to get, as an adult, an interest in birds. And I joined my local Audubon chapter, and found a out-of-print book at the library called The Audubon Society Guide to Attracting Birds by Steve Kress, who's the vice president of bird conservation at Audubon at the time. And I learned about planting a garden, that if I planted certain plants, the birds would come. And sure enough, I did. I planted red tubular flowers to attract red-throated hummingbird out in the East Coast here. And they came, and then that just changed. That was a revelation and transformed my whole gardening forever. I like to say I went from being a gardener and birder to a bird gardener, and started recognizing that, as Kay was saying, that birds, animals need certain habitat to survive, as we do. So that really, then anytime I gardened, it had to be eaten by something, either me, a bird, pollinator, or something. And that's what directs me. And here at the Native Plant Center, we're at Westchester Community College. We're also the first affiliate of the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center in Austin, Texas. And Mrs. Johnson actually visited our campus with her daughters in 1999, a year after we were started, because we dedicated a garden in her name. And we still have that garden. And she was, known as the environmental first lady, because she really inspired a lot of conservation initiatives during her husband's administration. So what we do really is a lot of education, as you can imagine. We have a sustainable gardening certificate with the community college. We do an annual landscape conference. We do extensive community outreach. We engage the STEM professors and students as a resource and in research projects. We advise the environmental club, and we do a host of other important things.
That's wonderful. And I can see right behind you some flowers that are probably attracting hummingbirds and butterflies.
That's it. That's bee balm right back there. And this is in front of my office. And this is a garden that we planted in a more formal setting, so homeowners can feel that they can plant native plants, because rather than having to do it in a restoration or a meadow situation.
Nice. Well, Kay, can we get started on some of the basics? What do we mean by native seeds? What other kind of seeds are there? Why is it important to differentiate these different types of seeds, non-natives, commercial varieties, and so on?
Sure. So today, like we did in the NAS report, I'll use native seeds as shorthand for all native plant materials, whether that's a seed, a plug, a potted plant, etc. But native, every plant is native to some place, a range where it grows naturally, where it evolved, where it existed before humans started moving plants around on a large-scale basis. And those native ranges can be quite widespread or quite narrow. And in many cases, they're changing as our climate changes. So the definition of a native seed or a native plant needs to include a place, so native to the US, native to Illinois, and it needs to respond to these dynamics that are happening in natural range shifts. Because native seeds evolved in a particular place, they have, through evolution, solved the challenges of living in that climate, in that soil. And so they're kind of uniquely adapted to a particular region. There are also non-native species, and those are species that evolved in different places, regions, countries, continents, as well as cultivars. And cultivar is just short for cultivated variety. And cultivars can be developed in many different ways. They may just be a selection from a wild population that has a unique trait of interest, a richer flower color, a shorter stature, whatever. They can be interspecific hybrids or intergeneric hybrids. But cultivars in general are typically reproduced clonally or are highly inbred lines, so they're genetically uniform, if not genetically identical. And in that way, they may not be ideally suited for restoration.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit more about restoration. It's one of the uses of native seeds, although, as we'll, I think, find out from Carol, not the only one. But what is restoration? And then would you advocate that restoration should is the standard that restoration should always use native seed rather than cultivars or non-native seed?
Mm-hmm. So the definition of ecological restoration is the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that's been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. And it can involve seeding or planting native species. It can involve restoring natural processes like fire. It can involve removing threats like invasive species. And then, if we think about what a successful restoration might look like, one of my favorite examples is here in this part of the world, the University of Wisconsin Arboretum, the prairie restoration done by Aldo Leopold. And he did that over 80 years ago, and it is a beautiful site, and it served as the foundation for prairie restoration in this part of the world.
So prairies are one big target of restoration then.
Yeah, and then, certainly in other parts of the country, much of the West is suffering from wildfire and invasive species. And so those public lands are probably the biggest users of native seed.
Okay. Now, so that we can understand the issues around native seeds better, what would happen if restoration was done with some other kind of seed? Are there examples where restoration has failed because it didn't use appropriate native seed?
Yeah, some of my favorite examples are some work happening right now, being done in Utah by Ott and Kilkenny, Francis Kilkenny, and they're looking at outcomes of post-wildfire restoration that was done 15, 16 years ago. And they set it up in a way to compare different seed mixes and different seed application methods. So they used a kind of business as usual, a conventional seed mix that had a number of non-native species in it. They used a diverse native seed mix. And what they're finding now, 15, 16 years later, is that the native seed restorations are far more diverse. They're seeing shrub recovery. They're seeing communities kind of return to the desired condition, what was there previous to the fire. And for the non-native seed mixes, most of those are dominated by a single species of grass, crested wheatgrass, and they're on a trajectory towards a novel ecosystem, something that never existed there before. And why does that matter? It matters because a diverse plant community supports insects, birds, wildlife. It works harder for us. So it's really important.
Yeah, so if you don't plant the right plants, then the whole ecosystem, including the insects and birds, doesn't come back the way that it was intended to. Thanks. That's really enlightening. There's other uses of native seeds too in more the landscaping and gardening context. And maybe Carol, you can tell us more about why people want to or should, however you'd like to put it, use native seeds in their own homes or in shopping malls or wherever else they're doing landscaping.
Sure. And, just to give perspective, so we're in the Northeast in Westchester County is butts New York City. So we're the county just north of New York City. We are 1 million people in, I think, 450 square miles. So it's pretty dense with a number of urban cities. And so many of our projects are helping home gardeners get back to nature, basically. And I call native plants the Swiss Army knife of the plant world because I find they're so versatile and they serve so many functions. And we don't have time to go into each one, but of course, as you said, provide wildlife habitat, sustain biodiversity, protect water quality, help mitigate climate change, and offer natural beauty. And also, they define local identity. And I have to mention that because until I worked here, I didn't think about that element of it. But Mrs. Johnson used to say wherever she went in America, she liked it when the land spoke its own language and its own regional accent. And we don't realize it, but how does it do that? But by the flora. And, even if you think of a beach and you think of palm trees and you think of a desert, you think of cactus. If you think of an alpine area, you think of conifers. And when I give presentations, I always show 3 different countries and the flora, and people always get the countries correct. It's usually Japan, Kenya, and Italy that I show. And we don't realize it when we travel to other parts of the world, we want it to look like that part of the world. So why wouldn't we want the Northeast to look like the Northeast and everywhere else to look like where it does? And it does that through native plants.
Yeah. And of course, we want those monarch butterflies and those hummingbirds
Mhm.
and all the animals that need those plants too.
Exactly. And, we talk about the coevolution of these animals with these plants, and that's why they depend on one another for survival. They've been
Right,
so many studies about
right,
that. Many people know the story about the monarch butterfly, how it's the caterpillars can only eat milkweed. That's it.
right, right.
So, if we don't have that, we don't have monarchs.
Well, and I think too that insects that eat plants are important too, right? Because if you plant a completely unfamiliar plant someplace, then the insects that eat that plant aren't there.
That's right.
And so that plant is sitting there with no little caterpillars and bugs on it, and that means that it's not a resource for nesting birds that
And,
need those
that's a
high
great
protein
point,
snacks.
Susan, because people say, well, I don't want insects, but 90% of our insects are specialists, meaning they only could eat certain plants. And Doug Tallamy, who's a entomologist at the University of Delaware and written many books, he did a study where the oak tree provides more than 500 species of insects, food for insects, for the caterpillars of moths and butterflies, Lepidoptera, and that chickadees, a little small third of an ounce bird, needs about 6,000 caterpillars to feed one nest of young.
Wow.
So that's
Wow.
a little bird, can, expand it to other
Right.
birds and sizes. So we
Right.
do need insects to continue
Yeah.
the food web.
Cool. And of course, we know insects are declining, so that's a really good reason to plant more of the plants they need. Well, let's dig in deeper then. And maybe Kay, you can take the first stab at this question. Why is there a problem? People want native plants. They want to use them for all these great uses. I think, as we'll learn more about, there are nurseries out there that specialize in growing and selling native seed, native plant material. So why is there a supply and demand problem here?
Well, a couple of reasons. One is scale. So much of the public land in our country is degraded, either by invasion of non-native species, by recreation, development, or wildfire. So hundreds of thousands of acres could benefit from restoration in the continental US alone. In a bad fire year, BLM can purchase upwards of 7 million pounds of seed. And that's just one agency, add on parks and refuges and the national forests, and you have a really big number. So we need a lot of seed to do the restoration that's ahead of us. And so it's a real challenge to have that volume stored somewhere, let alone that volume with appropriate genetics or appropriate ecoregions.
Yeah.
So we don't want just one type of big blue stem. We want big blue stem that's suited for, 10 or 20 different ecoregions.
Right.
And I think a lot of people don't appreciate that seed is alive and seed is perishable. And we can greatly extend its shelf life by keeping it cold and dry, or even frozen, but it doesn't last forever. So we need to do a better job of predicting when and where seed need will be.
Right.
And we need to give growers kind of a heads up of what we want and when we want it so they can begin to meet that demand.
Yeah, because it seems like ideally there'd be some money to be made here for someone. But it sounds like what you're saying is the demand can be huge, but it can also be unpredictable. If you
Yes.
grow a whole bunch of it and you don't have a cold warehouse to put it in,
Mhm.
you might lose big time. Is that the kind of thing?
That is the kind of thing. So yeah, it has a finite shelf life. And if you grow the wrong thing or you grow something for a region that doesn't burn, or there isn't a big need, or a budget gets cut or whatever, then you are
Ah,
left with that seed. And so there's a
so
lot we can do to help growers, kind of proactively restoring areas, promising that we're going to do 100,000 acres a year in a particular region, um, and then giving them a heads up and sharing the
uh-huh.
risk of them investing in the 4 or 5 year process it takes to produce and develop that
So
seed.
some planning and some coordination, sounds like.
Yes, exactly.
And Carol, how do these kinds of issues, or do these kinds of issues sort of scale down to the maybe smaller scale, more numerous types of native plant users that you deal with?
Sure. So each year, we have an amazing plant sale. It's less than a month away, so I'm going a little crazy. A native plant sale only, that we sell over 13,000 plants. So between our sale, and that's doubled in the last few years because people are really learning about native plants. And so between our garden, what we use for our gardens and the plants, we need about 14,000 native plants. And that can be a combination. And what we sell is between restoration style plants and nursery style plants. I had a fact from a couple of years ago. We had a conference on native plant seed sources and partnership solutions. And I was kind of stunned when I was told that only 25% of the nursery industry is native plants. So even though we feel when we're in the cocoon here of knowing, hey, doesn't everybody care about native plants? Well, in the larger gardening world, no, not yet. And that's where we hope to keep expanding. So you were asking about the vendors. So we don't grow our own. We use about a dozen or so vendors, and we'll change a few here or there, tweak them over the years, because another concern for us is neonics that pollinators. So when we found out one or two were using them, we stopped using them. So we're always watching for that as well.
You want to quickly explain that just to make sure the audience caught that what the neonics are and why you don't want them in your plants?
So neonicotinoids are pesticides, herbicides that kill mostly pollinators. And there are state laws now, or at least in New York, banning them from certain agricultural uses, but not widespread yet for all nursery uses. So we try to pick and choose which nurseries we're using accordingly, because we're not going to plant a native plant and only to attract the pollinator and then kill it. So
and then kill it.
It just doesn't seem right. But we've talked, some of the local family-run nurseries. We have one nursery that every year does a native plant benefit for us, and they actually bring in a lot of more native plants than usual and give us a percentage of everything that sells on that weekend. But they're in business over 100 years, and they say they can't stay in business if they would just to grow native plants. And another nursery owner told us, even though he does sell like 2% worth of ecotypes, he would need a greenhouse. He would really need to ramp up, and land around here is really expensive. I just looked up that in Westchester, the medium home price is $750,000. So, that's the land on that is expensive too. And to have a nursery, expand and grow, it's a challenge for them. So, but as more people are eager to grow native plants, I really see that the answer is going to be in the partnerships and the smaller.
Right. And we want to talk about some of those partnerships. Maybe we could go back to, like, Kay, you could talk about perhaps what some of the larger scale policy types of solutions or proposals are. And then we could go back to you, Carol, talking about these partnerships, the kind of more community level types of solutions that people are working on. So Kay, what kinds of things, either at the federal or state or tribal, regional level, either are being done or could be done to smooth out this supply and demand problem and to make it easier for growers to get in the business and stay in the business, and for people to get the supplies that they need?
Sure. I think most agencies now have a preference policy for using native plants, but most of those policies have loopholes that are quite large. Loopholes for using non-natives in emergency situations, when natives aren't available, when natives are too expensive, when the land is so damaged it may not support a native plant community. And the one about natives not being available or too expensive leads to this cycle of substitutions. And so a land manager may order a particular suite of species, and a grower might say, we don't have those, but will you take these? And if they say yes, there's less incentive for the green industry to develop the ecotypes and the species that are most desired. When we talked to growers, they said this unpredictable demand and the financial risk were really big obstacles to developing the seed that the restoration committee or community was asking for. And so forward contracting may be a way to help share that risk. The agency essentially investing in that long development process. Some of the things we recommended in the report were the need for a national interagency center or entity that coordinated policy between agencies. So it's really hard when a grower's hearing one thing from BLM, another thing from the Forest Service. If some of those policies were harmonized across agencies, we'd see a much clearer demand signal. And then the other was the need for these eco-regional programs. And I'll let you ask that.
Yeah, okay, we can come back to that, but it would be nice to hear more about the kind of the grassroots end of the effort from Carol. What are some examples of the local community partnerships that have been successful?
Sure. So there is a local 59 plant network that brings together many different stakeholders and trying to find sources of seed, grow the seed, look at all the issues. There is actually a county property. So going back a little bit, the Native Plant Center worked with the county executive in our county to pass a executive order that only native plants can be planted on county property. That's wonderful. However, policing it is always an issue. And actually, this county executive is now a U.S. representative in Congress. But anyway, one of the county properties, I bring this up because one of the county properties is actually creating founder plots, collecting seeds. They have a small staff, but they do a lot with volunteers and are hoping to kind of create a greenbelt, a nursery, which is in New York City, which has been very successful. They used to actually, we had one year last year, the last year that they were selling plants, we had bought plants for our plant sale, but then they stopped selling to just the general public. I think they really want to get established and provide plants for the county parks, and we have a lot of county parkland. And then there's a new nonprofit called Wildwoods Restoration Project that is really aiming to restore forest understories. So because we don't have these open tracts that the West does, most of ours is forest land that's degraded and has a lot of challenges from deer and invasive species, mostly pressures from. And so Linda Rohleder is the director, and she started this nonprofit just 3 years ago, maybe, and does it a lot with volunteers. There's a bunch of volunteers she brings in. They collect seed, they propagate it. They also take them home, and they're kind of foster parents for these because of the, where do you put all these plants? And then they go in and replant in often either private or state or nonprofit properties that request that. So that's where I really see that these partnerships are going to be the answer, because funding is not always there, obviously. Our state, I have to say, New York State is pretty generous with different grant programs, but it's always not enough.
And there's 49 other states.
There's 49 other states, yes.
Right. Well, one of the fascinating things that we learned on our National Academy Study Committee was that in between this kind of large federal scale that Kay just talked about and the very grassroots scale that you just talked about, Carol, there are these eco-regional partnerships. Sometimes it's a whole state. Sometimes it's multiple adjoining states like the Colorado Plateau states or the Great Basin states, but they form these regional, or I think you just call them, Kay, eco-regional partnerships to facilitate a whole bunch of aspects of the native seed supply. And Kay, maybe you can, you perhaps using one of those as an example, sort of break down why that scale is important and what can be accomplished there.
Sure. I think when we think about native seed, it's really inherently a regional product. It should be collected regionally, increased regionally, used regionally. It's not a good idea to move seed grown in Texas up here to Chicago. It won't like our cold winters. And so these eco-regional native plant programs really focus on what are the particular needs and the particular partners in a given area. They bring together a wide range of stakeholders. Many of them are collecting and curating foundation seed for their region. We heard Carol mention that. Many of them are conducting scenario planning to help predict seed need in the future How often does this area burn? How much seed are we likely to need every year, et cetera. And most of them are developing priority species lists for their region. What grows here? What is easily available in the green industry right now? What do we need to help the industry do to meet our additional needs?
Yeah, and I'd love to talk to more about some of those ways of supporting growers, but we do have to move on, and I do have to ask my big burning question, which I was asking throughout our National Academy study process too, which is climate change, right? I mean,
Yeah.
restoration, the very word, with the prefix RE,
Mhm.
it implies going back to the past and fixing things by putting them back the way that they used to be. And how do we think about that now? We have climate change. Are we still going to restore things to the way they were in the past? Or are we going to try to restore them towards some kind of a future condition? And how do we even think about that? And then how do we put that into practice? I know, Kay, you are a leading thinker in this space, and I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, you're right. It is a vexing problem. I think for decades, the gold standard, the mantra with restoration is local is best. We want to use local seed. It's adapted to the problems and challenges that our region faces. But if the climate is changing so rapidly that local really isn't local anymore, my climate here in Chicago is getting a lot more like St. Louis. Um,
You
should
have to
I
get
be
some
plant
seeds from St. Louis.
should I be getting my seeds from St. Louis? And so a lot of us are testing different provenancing strategies. So provenancing, where do you go to collect your seed to use in a restoration? Um, I can do local. I can do, a more composite approach where I'm bringing in seed from a wider region. I can even get a little bit predictive and say, what is this climate in Chicago going to look like in 15 years, in 30 years, in 80 years? And should I be preparing for that by bringing in seed from regions that have that climate now?
Right.
Um, this is a bit of a controversial topic because we don't know the answers yet, but we
Yeah.
are beginning the experiments to get those answers. And, one of the challenges is how far um, do you move germplasm? Do you move seeds? Because you might also be risking bringing in things that are maladapted, that bring in traits that aren't good for the local population. And so you
Right.
have to balance genetic diversity with local adaptation, all in a landscape that is constantly changing.
So what was a difficult problem has now become a sort of a four-dimensionally difficult
Yes.
problem. Yeah. Well, I've been prompted that we don't have a whole lot of time left, and we should move on to our Act Three, the sort of the wrapping up. And I think some of the kind of the looking ahead questions that we need to get to are first, Carol, how can we continue engaging the public and increasing public engagement in this area in supporting the use of native species? Do you have
Yeah,
any
so,
kind of general solutions to
you
offer
know,
for us?
I always find education is really a key. And
Mhm.
we have a lot of young new first-time homeowners coming up from Brooklyn and Queens, and they're so excited. They've heard about the use of native plants, and they want to have pollinators in their yards and birds. And so we have to bring them into the continuum, I say, and then move them along. I
Mhm.
think they get a little fearful when people then start saying, make them feel guilty, or they get indignant about something they haven't planted or have planted, so I feel that, and we really need to bring people into the native plant world, and education is really a way to go. But I also see that I'd also like to see that we have a lot of invasive species here, as you can imagine, that comes through the New York City port and other ways.
Mhm.
We have a lot of invasive removal projects and groups that do that. We're part of it. I'd like to see then not only the removal, but the restoration part, the planting of
Uh-huh.
planting of natives in those spots to help those sites recuperate. Um, and teaching the next generation of gardeners is really important. We work with our students here. We are actually doing a project with the Barack Obama School for Social Justice in a local area, who is actually creating a microforest on a little teeny way, a little plot of land, but they need some advice, and they're also although this was a federal grant that I think is now on hold, they were hoping to have a program to train urban foresters. So
cool.
the next generation is a really big deal, and teaching people how to observe as well and look at what your plant is doing. And, as Kay was saying, assisted migration is a tough term going on, but if it's plant or nothing, it's a good question to be asking, and it's a tough question to say, how far do we go to bring these species to a place they're not supposed to be, or then is it a native plant anymore? Is it an ecoregion anymore? Doesn't matter.
Okay.
Our cultivar is the answer. I know we didn't touch about that, but
yeah, we haven't talked about cultivars.
They're tougher. Who knows? Because we haven't gone through this before.
Right. And Kay, what are some areas where either like technical progress could be made, or ways to get technical tools into the hands of the people who need them, like the growers? What are kind of some of the technical solutions that we need more work on?
So there are a lot of digital tools out there available, from virtual herbaria, which helps you understand plant ranges, where to go to collect plants, to the seed lot selection tool done by the Forest Service, which can help you.
Explain? Yeah, go ahead and explain that real quick.
Yeah, sure. It helps you understand where you should be using a particular seed lot. And if you want to get into some of the predictive provenancing we were just talking about, where might a climate exist today that is expected to be in your region in the future? And, if you want to bring in a little germplasm in an experimental way and see how it works, that tool will help you do that. But I think one of the most tricky things is that every species is different, and developing it into a crop is a challenge every single time. How do you germinate that? How do you get it established in a row crop setting? How do you harvest it? How do you clean the seed? And when that research is in the hand of growers, one, it's very costly for them to do, and then it becomes a bit of a trade secret. And we have tackled this issue in agricultural crops for decades. The USDA has plant material centers that do this type of research and then share it in an equitable way with all growers.
With like ag extension programs, right?
Exactly. And so we need kind of that infrastructure, I think, for native crops that really share how to germinate and produce these species across the board.
Maybe some shared infrastructure like seed cleaning and warehousing and that kind of thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Cool. I'll ask the show organizers to give us a little reality check here. Is it time to switch to questions? Laura or Amanda? Yes. Okay. I'm getting a thumbs up from Laura that we should switch to questions. So I'm going to now look at what questions have come up. Getting a frozen screen. Frozen screen is preventing me from reading the questions. Okay, here we are. Okay. Gonna have a look here. All right, well, her first question is, how many generations does it take to rewild commercially produced seeds? And a follow-up to that is, how many generations to reduce domestication syndrome? So can you talk about how native seed stock is genetically altered just by the simple fact of cultivating it, and how that might be detrimental, and then how you would deal with that in a native seed production situation?
Sure.
That's a K question.
Yeah, every step of the native seed production process is an opportunity for inadvertent selection. So when we're collecting seed, we're selecting for the plants that have mature seed on that date. When we're cleaning it, we're selecting for the size of seeds that go through our sieves. When we're growing it, we're selecting for the individuals that like the conditions we're giving it, and so on and so forth. And so plants can adapt quite quickly. And when we grow them or increase them outside the region, if we use a lot of irrigation and then try to put them back in a desert area, we can have bad results. And we've looked a lot at the question, not how long does it take to get away from the syndrome, but how quickly can it happen in production?
Uh-huh.
And it can happen in a single generation if selection is strong enough, but usually by the third generation, I'm starting to get pretty nervous about those plants being significantly different than wild collected seed.
Right.
And so you could probably, flip that back the other way. How long does it take for them to readapt to wild conditions? It may take as little as one generation, or it may take three or four.
Yeah.
Um, but it is something we really need to consider when we're growing native seed.
Right. And I guess the usual strategy, right, is that not to try to rewild the cultivated seed, which has been altered by all these harvesting and collecting and cleaning practices, but to go back to the wild and get
Mhm.
new seed stock. That would be the typical approach, right?
Right. Bring in new germplasm.
Uh-huh. Which requires, of course, that you have some wild lands with some native plants growing on them. So we hope
Yeah,
that those lands are still there and that they're available for seed collection.
right.
Um, We're getting lots of questions about conservation seed mixes. Maybe Carol, you could take this one on. There are these mixes, and I've seen them myself in garden stores that say, California native wildflowers, or they probably have them for every part of the country. So if you go to a store and you buy a conservation seed mix, is that doing the right thing? Is that going to provide the kind of ecosystem services that we want out of native plants?
So often we see those packets and they don't have the native seeds to our area. They'll have California poppies, Siberian iris, what have you. So we always tell people to steer away from those mixes. We don't sell seed ourselves, but
Uh,
because they 95% of the time are not the seeds from our area. Or I have a story, tell that one time there was a project in my community, and they were planting English ivy, and we told them, why don't you plant Virginia creeper? And we gave them the botanical names and everything. And they came back with Boston ivy because they thought the word Boston was,
oh, it has Boston in
yeah,
it.
yeah. So that was native. But so yeah, it's always we tell people not to use those packets because we
Interesting. That's
haven't found them
good to
to
know.
be all native to our
Yeah.
area.
Certainly, if they don't have the right species in them, it's a good bet they don't have the right genetic
Oh,
mixtures in them too.
most
I think
likely,
that
right.
almost goes without
Right.
saying.
Mhm.
Cool. This is probably a good K question. Are these regional ecotypes of native species, adapted to different areas, being analyzed for their genetic characteristics to try to figure out what in their genetics might make them able to adapt or not able to adapt to climate change?
Yeah, that's a great question, and the answer is yes. So, for instance, I have a colleague who works in the Great Basin, and she's really interested in looking at what plants survive in that highly arid region, and kind of counterintuitively, she's deliberately trying to pick individuals from a population that are smaller because
Uh-huh.
often less above ground means more below ground and more ability to acquire water. And so, if you go back to kind of how we think about selecting cultivars or, varieties, you're often looking for big, beautiful plants, but in some areas and maybe in face of a changing climate, big beautiful up top isn't going to be big beautiful underground, and that may be a real problem.
Yeah. And if you grow your seeds on a well-watered farm,
Yes.
you're not selecting for the ones that can hack it out in the desert. That makes sense.
Exactly.
Are there actual, genetic, molecular level analyses that are helping shed light on these
Yeah, I'm
problems?
sure there are. That's not the kind of work that I do. I'm
Okay.
more into quantitative genetics than molecular
Ah, right.
genetics, but
Uh-huh.
I do know that there are people working on that.
Yeah, it makes sense that it would be an important sort of basic research topic. Um, We have a question, and either of you could take this if you like. Are there any situations in which you would say just let invasive species go because there's nothing we can do about them? And maybe I'll just take the liberty of extending that question. are there situations where you think that planting non-natives or cultivars is okay? But maybe since in respecting the questioner, let's start with, are there situations to just let invasive species go? How would you approach that question?
That's really a tough one. Some species we find behave very invasively for a while, and then they get less bad. Garlic mustard in our part of the world can dominate the understory of a forest, but 10, 12 years down the road, we have a lot less of it, even if we're not um, pulling it all the time. And so I think there are people looking at which ones do we really need to treat, kind of in a triage way, and which ones may just fade out on their own as the community improves
Uh-huh.
with regular large scale management like wildfire and
Uh-huh.
other things. Um, but most invasives uh, don't do that. They don't go away. They only get worse. And um, I don't know that I feel comfortable saying there are places we should just let them run amok.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Okay.
that said, there are places that are because of the history of the land use, like a lot of mine tailings, for example. Um, they're just not going to support a really healthy native plant community. And so we may need to look at what can grow there, what can hold the soil, what can do kind of the very basic ecosystem services, but may never be a diverse native community.
I'd like to
Thanks. Yeah, that makes sense.
add to
Yeah,
that.
Carol, you have something to add from the.
Yes, there's actually a scientist, security is just making sure I'm okay. Sorry. Eric Kiviat out of Hudsonia along the Hudson River, who has done studies to find these ecosystem services of invasive plants, because the challenge of eradicating every one seems so big and huge that he was trying to say, well, maybe there's some good elements of these bad plants and we can manage them. And, for instance, I remember when I was in watershed conservation and talking to him, he was telling me, there was a whole Phragmites stand, and I never realized that it was immobilizing the metals, the toxic metals in the soil
Oh,
into the river, the local river. So, it is a controversial subject whether to let any go, but it's interesting to see his studies on different invasives and the ecological benefits of some of them. But
uh,
even if you see an insect or a pollinator on it, does it mean it's getting the same value as it would
right.
be from a native plant? We don't know that. So I can't imagine it would, but who knows? Maybe they're adapted to that too.
Seems like a
But
good research project.
yeah, we remove the invasives. And garlic
Thanks.
mustard.
Well, on a totally different tangent, but a really important one, Kay, have you seen involvement of tribes in the kind of the native seed space? And related to that is traditional ecological knowledge being incorporated in both the production and the use of native seeds for restoration and related things.
Absolutely. There is a network of tribal nurseries that supports tribes doing native plant work on their own land. I'd like to see more support for that. Um, and I know of a number of projects. We heard of a few when we were working on our report of folks collecting seed on tribal land, working with um, tribal elders to incorporate indigenous knowledge and developing that seed for their own use. And I really applaud those efforts.
Cool. Um, Now this is a question for either of you, but maybe Carol, you'd like to take this. Well, I'll state it as originally stated by the questioner, but then we might have to modify it a bit. Person says, I have a lot of California natives in my garden, but have not found much information about when or how to collect seeds. I'm sure there's information out there. Any recommended information source, ideally that can be searched by species or common name? And I know, Carol, obviously you're not working in California, but in general, what are the kind of the informational resources for people who would like to collect seed?
Sure.
What should someone do if they just say, I would like to go actually out and find my own seed and use it in my garden? How would they learn how to do that?
So a lot of, first of all, well, certain states have native plant societies, and they may be a good source. If California has one, I don't know. I know Florida does.
They do.
That's a
Oh yeah, we do.
You do? Okay, you do. Actually, New York, we don't have one. I guess we'd be the
No.
closest to that. I can't imagine the internet is not showing up some good resources on that, and that probably even how to collect would be probably little YouTube videos out there or whatever.
Yeah.
But yeah, definitely seek out I have to say, and I don't know about the garden clubs in California, but I'm really proud of the garden clubs out here in the last decade or so. They went from being, pretty roses in my garden to really interested in conservation, and have, they advocate, they go to DC and advocate. They just are, so I would say garden clubs may have, if they are not the ones collecting, at least they would always have programs about that, and they would have some sources of
Yeah.
speakers that could lead you to hearing that. And really look at all the wonderful nonprofits who are having these programs. A lot of them are for free, and
Right.
really you get a lot of information from them.
Yeah, in California, some counties have very active native plant societies. I know because I'm on some of their email lists, and I think the county level might be a good place to look. And if you didn't find something direct information on the web, contacting the spokesperson for that county group might be a good way in. I wonder too if there might be a problem. Do you suppose that if someone were looking for information on how to collect seeds from the wild, could there be some concerns about over collecting? Might people be reticent about providing that information because they're worried that someone is going to go collect some relatively rare species? Kay is nodding. Do you have
Yeah,
anything
I would
to?
say so too. Yeah.
Yeah, there are some really good guidelines on how much seed to collect, provided by both Seeds of Success and the Millennium Seed Bank in the UK. But in general, you don't want to collect more than 20% of the seed crop, so that you're leaving enough for that population to reproduce itself. And the other thing I should point out is collecting seed requires a permit. You need permission of the landowner to go out and collect seed. And if you don't have that, you can actually get arrested for poaching seed from public lands. So make sure you know the rules and regulations. If you're doing it in your own garden, of course, no problem. But if you're
Right.
going out into wild areas to collect seed, you do need a permit.
That's a really good point. Let's see. I'm looking for it. Well, I guess we could take a question for either of you here. Kay, will the nursery production of seed for restoration potentially dilute the genetic diversity? I guess this question is asking, could it dilute genetic diversity in the wild if native plants are produced in nurseries and then deployed in the wild or in restored areas? Can that undermine the genetics of the surrounding wild population? And how would you work with that concern in a restoration project?
Yeah,
How
so
do people work with that concern, I guess I should say.
I mean, that's one of the concerns cited about bringing seed from too far away into a restoration setting, is that then it will cross with natural populations of that plant and may introduce maladapted traits to those populations. And so, again, trying to keep your seed sourcing regional. And then the other concern is if what is going into a restoration is genetically quite uniform or narrow, but a lot of that plant material, you can kind of swamp a native population genetically
Right.
with that. And the actual empirical examples of that are fairly few. But I do know of a rare coneflower in Tennessee, the Tennessee coneflower, and a lot of hybrids were showing up in the wild with other coneflowers planted in gardens. And the Nashville area where this plant occurs did a big educational campaign now 20, 25 years ago about, don't plant coneflowers, don't, endanger our special coneflower, the Tennessee coneflower.
Right.
And it worked. Most people did eradicate them from their gardens in order to save the really rare, the listed Echinacea tennesseeensis.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I've heard that concern being raised about sticky monkey flower in California, that there were some planted restoration populations that may have reduced the fitness of nearby native populations. Although you would think that natural selection might sort that out, but I don't know.
Yeah, and it would in, I think, a widespread genetically diverse population, but when it's a really
When you have a
rare
small,
or a
yeah,
small population,
right,
and
right, that
then
makes
you can
sense.
have problems.
Uh-huh. Well, this is a fun question, and because it opens the door to talking a little bit more about the U.S. situation in an international perspective. So that door is now officially open. But here's the question. In India, the National Bureau of Plant Genetic Resources has conserved 94,609 native Indian varieties of different crops and trees in gene banks located in different states. Is there a similar system in the U.S. at the federal or state level? So if you want to talk about both uh, in situ seed conservation, but also more generally, how does our native seed set of issues and problems stack up internationally in an
Yeah.
international perspective? To put it
Um,
bluntly, are there other countries that are doing better, and what can we learn from them?
well, there are other countries that are doing wonderful work, and India among them, Australia, Germany has a really robust native seed system. But we are also a leader, and I hope we continue to be one. I think we're the first country to come out with a national seed strategy that came out in 2015, which really provided a roadmap, of how do we develop the seed we need for restoration. We do have national gene banks, a very well-developed one for food crops and crop wild relatives in Fort Collins. And then, fingers crossed, one developing for native plants in Denver, this new National Interagency Seed and Restoration Center that was announced about a year ago. And it is in the planning phase right now, and fingers crossed that we see it move forward.
Uh-huh. I'll throw in my 2 cents worth, and you can respond to this. That when we were working on the National Academy's seed report, we did look into a little bit into the international angle. And while there are other countries that do have seed repositories, like the one from India that the questioner asked about, I got the impression that in general, this problem of producing enough seeds to get them into the hands of restoration is universal, and that we're actually not doing any worse than anyone else. In fact, we had outreach from someone in Australia who'd been leading a study of this problem, and it was his firm opinion that we're way ahead of Australia. Their problems are much worse.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Part of that being that in Australia, so much of what they want to restore are woody species that you can't really cultivate on farms. And so everything relies on collection from the wild. And in some cases, this would be from very fragmented, reduced, probably also burned wild populations. So they have a real, huge problem there. And he was really impressed with how many native seed farms there are in the U.S. And the idea that these farms are supplying our lands that are in the national cropland program, the name of which I always forget, but the system for retiring farmland temporarily.
CRP.
CRP, thank you, uses a lot of these seeds, which are somewhere between native and native cultivars. And he thought that was vastly larger scale success than what they've managed to achieve in Australia. And I don't think we came across any example of a country that had solved the supply demand problem, even though there are problems that do a lot of seed banking, which is great.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think it's always easy to be critical of your own system and see its flaws.
That's
and go
right.
to other countries and say, oh, wow, why can't we do that?
That's right.
And so, I go to Australia and I see a amazing progress on banking both orchid seed and the mycorrhizal fungi that the orchid depends on together. I see great progress in their mining industry of before a project happens, removing the plant material, banking it, propagating it, and putting it right back at the end. So the actual plant material that was on that site goes back onto that site. And so, I know we heard from the gentleman from Australia who thought we were doing great work, but they have some wonderful things going on too.
Yeah, like you say, you're always most aware of the problems you haven't solved yet in your own country.
Yes.
Um, Carol, we're kind of veering to another attack as usual. Can you give advice for people who live in cities and urban areas without a space to garden? And how can people in that situation best support native plants and maybe participate in some kind of urban gardening?
Sure. Well, a lot of communities have community gardens. Doesn't mean you only have to grow vegetables there. You could do that. If you have a terrace, you can do balcony gardening.
Mhm.
When I lived in an apartment building, I asked my landlord if I could garden in the very little the little strip in front of the building. And you know what? It became a community event. People would bring me
Yeah.
Mother's Day plants and people would stop. And I ended up learning, meeting a lot of people in my neighborhood. But join, there's so many groups out there that you can join. And if you don't have your own garden, we have if you're in New York, we have volunteer mornings on Mondays and Fridays in our gardens, and our volunteers don't even want to stop for winter. What do you mean it's going to be 30 degrees? We can go out, so I would say join groups that you can find spaces, and there's plenty of places around that have community gardens or botanical gardens or nonprofits who need your help. I think that's a great thing. You really learn from like-minded people and you're with kindred spirits. It's a really nice thing to
That's
do.
really great. As we're coming up on our time, I think it might be time for our final question for each of you, which is what is something you'd like our audience to take away from today's conversation? And I will just sidebar that is also an opportunity. If there is some really important subject we haven't gotten to, you could throw that in as the one thing you'd like the audience to take away, or you can go back to something you've already talked about, but that you want to really underscore. Kay, would you like to take a
Sure.
swing at that?
Yeah, and one of the things I like to tell people is native seed is one of our most valuable national natural resources. And it isn't thought about that way and it isn't treated as such, but I think it's really important to recognize we can't live without this. Um, I'd like people to recognize that seed is alive and treat it as such. I'd like people to recognize that every seed is literally a kernel of hope that that seed may confer more resilience in an ecosystem. It may help with food security. It may help provide a medicine that saves thousands of lives. And native plants support our way of life, and we need to work harder to support theirs.
Wow, that's really, I'd like to put that on my wall, right next to all the Native Plant Society posters.
Yeah.
That's really nice. And what about you, Carol?
Sure. I just quickly before I go into my little spiel, Kay, there's a movie, and I had to be on a film panel one year, and it was 3 different films, and one of them was the name Seed. That was the name of it. And even though it was more about food growing, it really showed the power. What a little seed, what is growing, what is going on with that. And so that's a beautiful thing, what you just said. But I like people to know that, we have the power to change demand. And so if we all demand more native plants because we want them to restore spots that are important to us or our own gardens, that we need to plant them and we need to go to the nurseries. And I think that there is a demand, the supply, the nurseries they're going to find out how to do it. They're going to help find out. And then it will impact if we get granting from federal, state governments, and really get out there and be involved and be observant and plant natives and create the demand. I think that's one of the things I like people to take away from.
No, that's great. So I think we have a couple more minutes. I didn't know how long your kind of final thoughts and observations would be. Would you like to just kind of recycle that question? And okay, is there another point or
I
maybe a
have a
point you haven't
question.
raised yet that you wish we had talked about? And then same with you, Carol.
I actually have a question. Maybe Kate can ask it. So
Cool.
what happens with rare and extirpated plants in a region? Are they gone forever, or do we try to go somewhere else to another ecoregion, even it's to find those seeds?
Yeah, so it depends very much on the species and its natural history. Many rare species we have in the seed bank already. And we're just waiting for a day where it's safe to put them back out, a day where there is intact habitat where they can live, a day where the threats that drove them to extinction in our area are gone. I work with a rare native thistle that is threatened by biocontrol weevils. And, there's no sense putting it back out in the wild until those weevils are gone. And so, the seed bank is this place of great hope and great promise, but also, can be sad thinking about the places for these plants just don't exist anymore. But yeah, many cases reintroductions are successful, and we're getting them back out.
Yeah, that's really cool. Favorite plants? Does everybody have a favorite native plant?
It's like asking your favorite kid, isn't it?
Well, I'll tell you mine. Asclepias solanoana is a native endemic milkweed found only on serpentine, and it grows flat on the ground, but then sticks up this kind of ball-like pink flower head that is just gorgeous. So that's mine. I can choose. Can you?
All right, I can choose Enothera organensis, an evening primrose from the Organ Mountains of New Mexico. So not native to Illinois, but native to New Mexico. It is a plant I worked on in the past, and I do grow it in a container in my yard, and every night at sunset in the summer, the flowers literally burst open in a few seconds. And there is nothing better than sitting on the patio with a glass of wine and watching those flowers burst open.
And they bring in things like hawk moths too, right?
Definitely, yeah, they're hawk moth
those are great.
pollinated.
Yeah. How about you, Carol?
Well, it's so funny. Every time I give a tour, I'm always saying, "Oh, you got to have that plant. Oh, I love that plant." They said, "You say that plant." Cornus Florida. I love the dogwood. I think it's a multi-season plant. It services so much, and especially birds love it too. And it gives you a beautiful fall foliage. It has a beautiful white bracts, in another month or so.
Right.
And the red berries are really just eaten up and relished by birds, migrating and otherwise. And the fall foliage, and then even the bark is really beautiful in the winter.
Well, thank you. I think we're up to our time, right? Laura is holding up her thumb, so thanks. Thank you both very much. It's been a really fun conversation.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you to the National Academies.
Okay, over and out.
Great. Thank you all so much. While you were closing, I had to look up the Latin name for my favorite plant to kind of fit in here. So my favorite is the Black Eye Susan, which is Rudbeckia hirta. There we go. Okay.
Nice.
Anyways, thank you all so much for that wonderful conversation. Susan, thank you for moderating. Kay and Carol, thank you for sharing all the incredible work that you're doing to sustain our native ecosystems. You as well, Susan. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. We appreciate your interest, your excellent questions, and sharing your thoughts on Slido. We do read all the feedback we receive from our viewers, so please take our survey or just email us directly at climatecrossroads@nas.edu. With your thought, the conversation was recorded and will be available to view on the same page immediately after we end. If you found the webinar informative, we encourage you to share it on social media. Finally, if you haven't already, please register for our climate newsletter or follow us on LinkedIn at NASEM Climate to get all things climate at the academies. Our April conversation is going to look at AI's impact on our nation's energy systems and how leaders in the industry are navigating the complexity. So please do keep an eye out for the link in our newsletter. And finally, as always, a big thanks to all my National Academies colleagues who supported today's event behind the scenes. And thank you all again for joining. We'll see you in April.